The police never solved it. 3 attempts on the life of one of the country's richest men, and every single time, the investigation quietly stalled, evidence disappeared, and the case was closed as an accident. What confused investigators most wasn't the attempts themselves. It was the man at the center of them. A blind billionaire who never once asked for extra security, never once panicked, and whose staff swore could navigate a mansion full of hidden security cameras and locked rooms without ever touching a wall. The woman forced to marry him believed, at first, that she had been handed the worst deal of her life. She had no idea she was about to become the only person capable of uncovering a secret that had been buried inside one family for almost a decade, a secret worth billions, and one that someone was willing to kill to protect. Before we get into how Olivia Bennett ended up at the center of all of it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this story, because what happens in the next 10 minutes alone will change how you see everyone in this family. Olivia grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, the forgotten daughter in a house that once felt like home before her mother died, and her father remarried a woman who treated her like hired help. Her stepmother, Margaret, and stepsister, Chloe, took everything that once belonged to Olivia's family, down to the paintings her mother left behind, paintings that vanished from the walls one by one until Olivia stopped asking where they went. She spent her nights sketching buildings in a notebook she kept hidden under her mattress, holding on to the one dream nobody in that house could take from her. She had no idea that notebook, and the quiet, careful habits it built in her, would one day become the exact skill that saved a man's life. Everything changed the day a black car pulled into the driveway, and a man named Ethan Hale stepped out carrying a leather folder that made Olivia's father go pale before a single word was spoken. 9 years earlier, Gary Bennett had taken a loan from a billionaire named Joseph Hale to save his failing business, and buried inside that agreement was a single condition nobody expected to matter. If Joseph's son ever needed a wife, one of Gary's daughters would be required to marry him. Joseph's son had once been a promising heir with perfect vision and a future laid out in front of him. Now he was a man the public knew almost nothing about, a man rumored to have lost his sight years earlier in an accident that was never fully explained. That night, Olivia listened outside a closed door as Margaret decided her fate in seconds. It has to be Olivia. She doesn't have anything to lose. Nobody asked what Olivia wanted. Nobody ever did. If you were told your family had chosen your future without you in the room, would you have confronted them or stayed silent the way Olivia did? Let us know in the comments, because the choice she made that night would matter more than she could have possibly known. 3 weeks later, Olivia met Ethan Hale for the first time, and nothing about him matched what she expected. She had pictured a fragile man who needed guiding by the elbow. Instead, she found someone calm, sharp, and unnervingly aware of things a blind man shouldn't have been able to notice. He heard the nervousness in her breathing before she said a word. He reached for a teacup that had been placed slightly off from where it usually sat and adjusted his hand by less than a centimeter before anyone could see him miss it. It was such a small detail that almost nobody would have caught it, but Olivia caught it. And it planted a question in her mind she wouldn't be able to shake for months. Was Ethan Hale really as blind as everyone in that family wanted the world to believe? The wedding happened 6 weeks later, a cold, obligatory ceremony with no love in the room, only the appearance of it for the cameras Margaret had hired. As the reception wound down, Olivia overheard a distant relative mutter 5 words to another guest near the bar, words she would never forget. He should have died years ago. By the time she turned around, the man had vanished into the crowd. Nobody around her seemed to have heard it but her. She spent the rest of that night wondering who in that family hated Ethan enough to say something like that out loud on his own wedding day, and what exactly he had done to deserve it. She would get her answer, but not before the mansion itself gave her far more questions than answers. Olivia moved into the Hale estate 3 days later, and almost immediately, something about the house felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite name. Security cameras were mounted at angles that watched hallways rather than doors. Certain rooms stayed locked even to family. Staff lowered their voices the moment she walked past specific corridors, and one entire wing of the mansion, the East Wing, was sealed off completely, its heavy double doors secured with a lock that looked newer than anything else in the house. When she asked a young housekeeper named Priya why that wing was closed, Priya only said it had been that way since before she started working there, and that questions about it made people uncomfortable. Olivia filed that answer away in the back of her mind, the same way she used to file away every unfair thing that happened to her growing up. Quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment it would matter. That moment came sooner than she expected. Late one night, unable to sleep, Olivia wandered the halls and found a light on in the estate's private gym. Inside, she found Ethan moving through a full set of exercises, with complete precision, no cane, no hesitation, no sign whatsoever of the fragile man the family presented to the world. He sensed her in the doorway before she said anything. "You're not supposed to be up this early," he said. "Neither are you," she answered. "Or is this something you don't want anyone to know about?" He was quiet for a long moment before admitting something that would only make sense to her much later. "There are people in this house who are more comfortable with me being weak. It's safer for me if they keep believing that." At the time, Olivia assumed he simply meant the family looked down on him. She had no idea how literally true that sentence actually was, or how many people in that house had built their entire position on the assumption that Ethan Hale could never fight back. The first attempt on his life came less than 2 weeks later. A heavy ceramic planter fell from a second-floor balcony as Ethan walked the garden path below, missing him by less than a foot. Staff blamed old brackets and bad weather. Ethan said nothing, but Olivia noticed the way his jaw tightened as he stared up at the balcony, a balcony that, she would later learn, only 2 people in the entire household had keys to access. The second attempt happened during a routine drive into the city, when the brakes in Ethan's car failed completely less than a mile from the estate. The driver barely avoided a collision using the emergency brake. When mechanics examined the vehicle, they discovered the brake line hadn't worn down. It had been deliberately cut, in a way designed to fail only once the car reached higher speeds. The third attempt was the one that made Olivia understand this was no longer something she could ignore. During dinner one evening, Ethan pushed his plate away, saying quietly that something tasted wrong. Testing later confirmed a substance in his food capable of causing serious harm. The official story was contamination. Ethan didn't believe it, and neither did Olivia. That night, in the estate's private library, he finally told her the truth he had carried alone for years. "Someone in this family has been trying to get rid of me since before you and I ever met. I don't know exactly who, but I know it isn't random, and I know it hasn't stopped." 3 attempts, 3 near misses, and a house full of people who all had reasons to want Ethan gone. If you were married into a family like this, would you have stayed to uncover the truth or found a way out to protect yourself? Tell us honestly in the comments, because Olivia's decision to stay is exactly what set the rest of this investigation into motion. Olivia decided that if nobody else in that house was going to protect Ethan, she would. She started paying attention to everyone, and almost immediately, the list of people who might want Ethan dead grew far longer than she expected. There was Richard Hale, Ethan's uncle, the same man who had delivered the marriage agreement to her father years earlier. Richard spent late nights locked in the estate's private office, and staff seemed to tense whenever he was in the room. There was Walter Pierce, the family's longtime attorney, a man who had grown visibly more anxious over the past several months, sometimes glancing over his shoulder as though he expected to be followed. There was Margaret herself, Olivia's own stepmother, who had somehow ended up on the guest list for several private Hale family gatherings that had nothing to do with Olivia, gatherings Margaret never explained. There was Priya, the young housekeeper who always seemed to appear exactly when Olivia was getting close to something, always with a reasonable excuse for being there. And there was even Joseph, Ethan's own father, a man who had been distant from his son for years, a man whose absence from Ethan's life had never fully been explained. For one unsettling night, Olivia even found herself wondering about Ethan. What if the blindness wasn't real at all? What if the attempts on his life weren't attempts at all, but something staged to win sympathy, to hide something else entirely? She hated herself for the thought almost as soon as she had it, but she couldn't quite shake it either, not until she watched him wince in pain one morning, after walking directly into a side table that had been moved from its usual place the night before. Whatever Ethan was hiding, she realized, it wasn't that. That left everyone else, and Olivia had no way of knowing, yet which one of them was capable of murder. She started keeping a notebook again, the same instinct that had once filled pages with building sketches, now filling pages with dates, names, and small details that seemed meaningless on their own. Which nights Richard's office light stayed on past midnight. Which staff members went quiet around him. which days Margaret visited the estate without explanation. It was slow, patient work. She had no idea at the time that this notebook would eventually become the single most important piece of evidence in a case involving millions of dollars and years of buried lies. 3 months into the marriage, Olivia attended her first company event with Ethan, a formal gathering of investors at Hale Industries headquarters. She expected him to be pitied the way he was at home. Instead, the moment they entered the boardroom, every person in the room stood. Investors greeted him by name. One senior board member spoke to him not as a family member being humored, but as the person whose signature controlled the company's direction. An older investor named Harold Whitfield pulled Olivia aside and told her something that reframed everything she thought she understood about her husband. Ethan built half of what this company is today. Not his uncle, not the board members who like to take credit. Olivia realized, standing in that boardroom, that Ethan's silence at home had never been weakness. It had been strategy. What she didn't yet understand was exactly what, or who, he had been protecting himself from all this time. That night, on the drive home, Ethan finally admitted something. He had been quietly running major decisions inside the company for almost 6 years, hidden from most of the family, because the moment anyone realized how much power he actually held, he believed his life would be in even greater danger than it already was. Olivia asked him directly who he suspected. He wouldn't say a name. "I don't have proof yet," he told her, "and accusing the wrong person could get us both killed." The words sat heavy in the car the rest of the way home, because for the first time, Olivia realized this wasn't just Ethan's danger anymore. It was hers too. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Olivia sat alone by the window of their room, watching the dark outline of the east wing across the courtyard. A single light flickered on in one of its sealed windows, then went dark again just as quickly. She had never seen a light in that wing before. She told herself it was nothing. She would spend the next several weeks realizing exactly how wrong that assumption was. Roughly a month later, Walter Pierce, the family attorney, vanished without explanation for nearly a week. No notice, no forwarding information, nothing but an empty office and a locked filing cabinet nobody else had the combination to. The unease that settled over the estate during those 7 days was different from anything Olivia had felt before. A quiet, constant tension that made even the household staff move differently through the halls. When Walter finally resurfaced, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. He requested an urgent private meeting with Ethan and Olivia, arriving in a car that wasn't his own, wearing clothes that looked slept in, asking before anything else whether the room was free of listening devices. Only then did he speak. Years earlier, Joseph Hale had drafted a will naming Ethan the sole heir to the company, with protections in place specifically in case anything ever happened to his health or his sight. That original will, Walter said, had gone missing from the family vault sometime in the past year, quietly replaced with a different version, one that redirected a significant portion of ownership toward Richard Hale. Ethan asked the only question that mattered. "Who had access to that vault besides you?" Walter's hands were shaking. "Only 3 people. You, your father, and Richard." For the first time since Olivia had known him, Ethan looked less like a man in control and more like a man trying to hold himself together. Because his father, the man who had stayed distant for years, now had a motive and the opportunity to have been involved in stealing his own son's inheritance. Olivia thought she finally understood who was behind everything. She was about to discover just how wrong that assumption was, and the truth would come from the one person in the family she had least expected to trust. 2 days later, Joseph Hale requested a private meeting with his son for the first time in nearly 3 years. Olivia sat quietly in the corner as Joseph, thinner and more tired than she'd ever seen him, finally told Ethan the truth he'd been hiding since the accident that took his son's sight years earlier. "I didn't abandon you because I stopped caring," Joseph said, his voice breaking. "I distanced myself because it was the only way to protect you. Richard had already turned half the board against me by then. If I'd shown the world how much I still believed in you, he would have moved against you long before you were ready to defend yourself." He explained that he had secretly funded the specialists working on Ethan's recovery for years, doctors whose names never appeared on any record connected to the Hale family, quietly hoping for a recovery he never dared mention out loud. Ethan sat in silence, years of resentment reshaping itself into something closer to understanding. But even as father and son began to repair what years of distance had broken, one question remained unanswered. If Joseph hadn't touched the will, and if Ethan hadn't either, that left only one name. And Richard Hale was about to prove far more dangerous than anyone in that house had prepared for. If you had a parent who distanced themselves from you for years, only to discover it was done entirely to protect you, do you think you could forgive them the way Ethan eventually did? Let us know honestly in the comments, because forgiveness is not the easiest part of what comes next. With Joseph cleared, Olivia turned her attention back to the notebook she'd been filling for months. She began cross-referencing her own observations with what Walter had uncovered, and one detail stopped her cold. The night the ceramic planter fell from the balcony, her notes showed Richard's car had left the estate less than 20 minutes before the incident. The week the brakes were cut, her notes showed the household's regular mechanic had been unexpectedly given the week off, replaced by a temporary hire who had never worked on the property before or since, a hire Richard's assistant had personally approved. And the week of the poisoning, the estate's usual head chef had been on vacation, replaced by a cousin of Richard's who had never set foot in that kitchen before. None of it, on its own, would have been enough. Together, it was damning. But even as the evidence against Richard mounted, Olivia couldn't shake a nagging detail that didn't fit. Priya, the young housekeeper who always seemed to appear at the exact wrong moments, had also been present near the estate's security room, the same week the brake line footage mysteriously went missing from the system. Olivia decided to confront her directly. What she learned in that conversation would completely change the direction of the investigation. Priya didn't deny being near the security room that week. But instead of the guilt Olivia expected to see, she saw something closer to relief, as though Priya had been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask her the right question. "I wasn't erasing anything," Priya admitted quietly. "I was trying to save a backup before someone else deleted it permanently. Mr. Hale asked me to. Not Ethan. Joseph." It turned out Joseph, even during the years he'd kept his distance, had quietly placed a handful of trusted staff inside the estate, people loyal to him rather than to Richard, tasked with watching for exactly the kind of danger that had been circling his son for years. Priya had been one of them the entire time, feeding small pieces of information back to Joseph whenever something seemed wrong, without ever being able to explain her actions to Ethan or Olivia directly for fear of the entire arrangement being exposed too soon. At the time, Olivia had no idea just how much that quiet network of loyal staff had already protected Ethan from far worse than what she knew about. She would only learn the full extent of it much later, once the truth about the East Wing finally came out. Because the East Wing, the one place in the entire estate Olivia had been kept away from since the day she arrived, held the answer to a question she hadn't even known to ask yet. If you're still with us at this point, type "I'm still here" in the comments. It genuinely helps us know how many of you are staying until the biggest reveal in this story, and we read every single one. It happened almost by accident. Olivia was searching for Ethan late one evening when she noticed the heavy double doors to the East Wing standing slightly open, the newer lock hanging loose from its frame as though someone had left in a hurry. She hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The wing wasn't abandoned the way the rest of the family assumed. It had been converted, quietly, into something closer to a private research space. Whiteboards covered in handwriting Olivia recognized as Ethan's own lined one wall. Medical files, folders, printed research on ocular recovery treatments filled a long table near the window. And on a second table sat a stack of documents with the Hale Industries letterhead, financial records that didn't match anything she had seen shared publicly with the board, records tracking transfers that had been quietly redirected over several years into an account that wasn't in Ethan's name, wasn't in Joseph's name, and wasn't in Richard's name either. It was in Margaret's. Olivia stood frozen in that room, staring at her own stepmother's name printed across a Hale Industries financial document, unable to make sense of how the woman who had spent years treating her like unpaid help could possibly be connected to any of this. Her mind raced back to something she had buried and nearly forgotten. Years earlier, her mother's paintings had disappeared from their childhood home without explanation. What if that disappearance hadn't been a random decorating decision by Margaret at all? What if it had been something else entirely, something connected to money Margaret had been receiving from inside the Hale family long before Olivia ever knew the Hales existed? She had walked into that room looking for answers about Ethan's blindness. She walked out with a question far more personal and far more disturbing than anything she'd expected. What exactly was her own stepmother's relationship to this family, and how long had it existed? Before she could process any of it, she heard footsteps in the hallway behind her. It was Ethan. And the look on his face when he saw her standing in that room told her immediately that whatever she had just found, she was never supposed to see it. At least not yet. He didn't get angry. He simply closed the door quietly behind them and sat down across from her. And for the first time since she'd known him, he told her everything, all at once, without holding anything back. The East Wing had been his private space for years, a place where he tracked both his own recovery and every financial irregularity he'd been quietly investigating inside the company. The research on his eyesight was real. His vision had, in fact, been slowly returning for the past 2 years, something he had told almost no one, not even his father in full detail, because he needed to know exactly who would still treat him with respect if they believed nothing about his condition would ever change. Olivia understood immediately, because she was one of the very few people who already had. As for Margaret's name on those financial records, Ethan explained that he had discovered it only recently himself, buried inside years of transfers that had been disguised as consulting fees paid out through a shell company. He hadn't yet figured out whether Margaret had been an active participant or simply a person being paid to stay quiet about something she happened to witness years earlier. What he did know was that the transfers had started around the same time Olivia's mother's paintings disappeared, which meant the two mysteries, one from Olivia's childhood and one from Ethan's company, were somehow connected. Neither of them yet understood exactly how. But they were about to find out that the answer led directly back to Richard, and that Margaret's silence had been bought, years earlier, to help cover up something far larger than a missing collection of paintings. Together, Ethan and Olivia brought everything to Walter, who was finally ready to move. Weeks of quiet evidence gathering became one final piece of documentation. Timelines, financial trails, and testimony, all pointing toward Richard Hale as the person who had orchestrated the forged will, the sabotage, and years of payments designed to keep anyone who might have noticed permanently silent, including a woman in Ohio who had been paid to make a dead schoolteacher's paintings quietly disappear. An emergency shareholders meeting was called 3 weeks later. It was, without question, one of the tensest mornings Olivia had ever experienced. Reporters gathered outside Hale Industries headquarters after word leaked that something significant was coming. Inside the boardroom, Walter Pierce presented recordings, financial records, and documentation proving that Richard had orchestrated the theft of the original will, along with years of financial misconduct, including the payments traced back to Margaret Bennett. Richard sat frozen at the head of the table as the evidence was laid out piece by piece in front of every major investor in the company. When asked directly whether he had any involvement in the incidents that had endangered Ethan's life over the past year, he said nothing. He simply stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the boardroom without a word. He didn't get far. 2 days later, authorities located Richard at a private airstrip roughly 90 miles outside the city, preparing to leave the state entirely. He didn't resist. During formal questioning, he confessed to everything: the falsified will, the years of payments to Margaret to keep her silent about the paintings he'd had quietly sold off, using the proceeds partly to fund the very campaign of sabotage against his own nephew. The cut brake line, the tampered food, the planter dropped from a balcony only he had access to. When asked why, his answer was simple. He could not accept a blind nephew inheriting a company he believed should have belonged to him, and every dollar, every lie, and every attempt on Ethan's life had been in service of that single belief. During questioning, Richard also admitted something Olivia had wondered about since her own wedding night. He was the one who had whispered those 5 words at the reception, certain the marriage would only complicate his plans, never expecting the bride herself would overhear him, and never expecting she would become the person who eventually helped bring the entire scheme down. 6 months later, life at the Hale estate looked completely different. Ethan finally allowed his recovery to become public, choosing to reveal, in a quiet statement to the people closest to him, that his vision had returned to nearly 70% of what it once was. He told Olivia, sitting together on the back porch as the sun went down, exactly why he had kept it hidden for so long. "I wanted to know who would still treat me the same," he said, "even if they thought nothing about me was ever going to change." Olivia understood, because she had been one of the very few people in that house who already had. As for Margaret, the truth about her silence, and the money she had accepted in exchange for it ended her marriage to Olivia's father once it became public. Chloe, who had spent years believing herself the more fortunate daughter, found herself facing a very different reality once the money that had funded her lifestyle disappeared, along with the family's reputation. Gary reached out to Olivia in the months that followed, and though their relationship would never look the way it had before her mother passed away, it slowly became something honest, which was more than Olivia had once believed possible. Olivia's mother's paintings were eventually tracked down and purchased back by Ethan, restored and hung quietly in a hallway of the estate without telling her beforehand. When she found them there one afternoon, she stood in that hallway for nearly 20 minutes without saying a word, staring at the sunflowers her mother had painted years before any of this began. The company Ethan had spent years quietly building continued to grow under his full public leadership, this time without anyone left in the family trying to undermine him from within. And Olivia, once the forgotten daughter with a notebook full of sketches nobody believed in, enrolled in the architecture program she once thought she'd never afford, with Ethan sitting quietly in the back row of every presentation, watching her build the future she was once told she didn't deserve. Sometimes the greatest inheritance a person can receive isn't money, or a company, or a name. Sometimes it's simply being seen clearly by another person, at the exact moment the rest of the world has decided to look away. If you were in Olivia's position, forced into a marriage you never chose, surrounded by people who all had a reason to lie to you, would you have trusted anyone in that house? Let us know honestly in the comments below, because we read every single one. And if you found the twists in this story hard to believe, wait until you see what happened when a billionaire disguised himself as an ordinary security guard inside his own bank, just to find out who among his own employees he could still trust. Click the next video on your screen, because you won't believe what he uncovered.